Picture this. London, 1753. A bright spring afternoon, the kind that makes the city almost bearable. Two fashionable young aristocrats, silk waistcoats, powdered wigs, the faint smell of expensive perfume barely masking the stench of the streets, are standing at a set of iron gates. The woman is giggling behind her fan. The man is fishing in his pocket for coins. A penny each. That's the price of admission. They're not here to see a play, not here for a concert or a public execution, though executions are free and considerably more popular. No, they've come for something else entirely, something that polite society considers perfectly acceptable entertainment. They've come to see the lunatics. The gates open. A keeper leads them inside, down a long corridor that smells of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, and something else, something animal and desperate that clings to the back of the throat. On either side, cells, iron bars, and behind those bars, human beings. Some are naked, their clothes having been taken or torn to shreds. Some are chained to the walls by their ankles or wrists, the iron worn smooth by years of struggling. Some sit motionless, staring at nothing. Others pace or rock or mutter to themselves in languages that might once have been English. And some, the crowd favorites, perform. There's a man who believes he's the King of Denmark. He'll give you a royal address if you throw him a coin. There's a woman who prophesies the future in rhyming couplets, her predictions becoming more elaborate the more you pay. There's a former sailor who'll strip off what remains of his clothes and dance if you poke him with a stick. The keepers sell sticks at the door for this purpose. The aristocratic couple laughs. They've gotten their penny's worth. On their way out, they stop at the gift shop. Yes, there's a gift shop. You can buy commemorative tokens, illustrated guides to the most entertaining inmates, small souvenirs to remember your visit to England's most famous attraction. Welcome to Bedlam. This isn't fiction. This isn't exaggeration. For over a century, visiting Bethlem Royal Hospital, known to everyone simply as Bedlam, was one of London's most popular forms of entertainment. At its peak, the hospital drew nearly 96,000 paying visitors per year. That's more than many modern museums, more than most theatres. The insane were exhibits, attractions, less than human and therefore fair game for mockery, for prodding, for the satisfaction of seeing someone worse off than yourself. And the word itself, Bedlam, has entered our language as a synonym for chaos, disorder, pandemonium. When we say a situation has become Bedlam, we're invoking the memory of this place, this institution, these suffering people. We just don't realize it. Tonight, we're going to remember, because the story of Bedlam isn't just about cruelty to the mentally ill, though there's plenty of that. It's about what happens when society decides that certain people don't count as fully human. It's about the thin line between patient and prisoner, between treatment and torture. It's about how easily civilization can convince itself that horror is entertainment. And it's about the question that haunts every era, including our own. What do we do with the people whose minds work differently? The ones who see things that aren't there or believe things that can't be true? The ones who frighten us because they remind us how fragile sanity really is? Bedlam's answer was chains, darkness, and a penny admission. We'd like to think we've evolved beyond that. But have we really? Or have we just gotten better at hiding our bedlams from view? Before we descend into the darkness of Bedlam's history, I want to ask something of you. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be remembered, if you think we have an obligation to look at what our ancestors did and ask uncomfortable questions about ourselves, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. Your support allows us to continue illuminating the darkest corners of the past. Tonight, we journey through nearly 8 centuries of history. From a medieval priory founded with good intentions to a Georgian theatre of cruelty. From chains and spinning chairs to the reformers who finally said, "Enough." We'll meet the patients, the political prisoners, the inconvenient wives, the genuinely ill, who suffered within these walls. We'll witness the treatments that were supposed to cure them, but more often killed them. And we'll ask whether we've truly left Bedlam behind, or whether we've simply moved it out of sight. This is the story of Bethlem Royal Hospital, the House of Madness, the place that gave chaos its name. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. The year is 1247. Henry III sits on the throne of England, a king more interested in building cathedrals than fighting wars. The Crusades are winding down, but the church still needs money, still needs to maintain its presence in the Holy Land. Into this world comes a man named Simon Fitzmary, a wealthy alderman of London who decides to donate some of his land for a religious purpose. He gives a plot outside Bishopsgate, then the edge of the city, to the Bishop of Bethlehem, who uses it to establish a small priory. The Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem. Nothing grand, just a few buildings, a chapel, some monks. Its primary purpose is to collect alms, charitable donations that will be sent back to support the Mother Church in the actual Bethlehem, in the Holy Land. There's nothing in the founding documents about madness, nothing about hospitals or patients. It's just another small religious house in medieval London, one of dozens scattered across the city. But something changes over the next century. The records are sparse, the details murky, but by 1330, less than 100 years after the founding, documents refer to the priory housing distracted persons. Distracted. It's a medieval euphemism. It means people whose minds have wandered from reality, people who hear voices, who see things that aren't there, who believe themselves to be kings or demons or animals. People who, in the language of the time, have been touched by something beyond human understanding. England's first institution for the mentally ill has been born. Not through any grand plan, but gradually, almost accidentally. The monks start taking in the mad because, well, someone has to. And the church, after all, is supposed to care for those whom the world has abandoned. To understand what Bedlam would become, you have to understand how medieval people thought about madness. There was no concept of mental illness as we understand it. The very idea that the brain could malfunction the way a liver or a lung might malfunction wouldn't emerge for centuries. Instead, madness was understood through 3 overlapping frameworks: religious, humoral, and supernatural. The religious explanation was the most common. Madness was divine punishment for sin, or divine testing like Job's afflictions, or demonic possession. The mad were caught in a spiritual battle, their souls the battlefield, their symptoms the evidence of warfare between God and Satan. This explanation made monasteries the natural place to treat the mad. prayer, fasting, holy water, exorcism. These were the appropriate responses to what was essentially a spiritual problem. Chains and confinement weren't cruelty. They were protection, keeping the possessed person from harming themselves while the demons were driven out. The humoral explanation came from ancient Greek medicine, filtered through centuries of Arabic scholarship. According to this theory, the human body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And health depended on keeping these humors in balance. An excess of black bile, in particular, was thought to cause melancholy, depression, and eventually madness. This theory justified bleeding, purging, and other physical interventions. If madness came from too much of a particular fluid, the solution was to drain that fluid out. The treatments were brutal, but they were at least trying to address what was seen as a physical cause. The supernatural explanation overlapped with both. Witchcraft could cause madness, the evil eye, curses, the influence of the moon, which is where we get the word lunatic, from luna, the moon. The mad were victims of malevolent forces, whether demonic or magical. What all 3 explanations shared was a sense that the mad were fundamentally different from normal people. They had crossed a boundary into another state of being. They were no longer quite themselves, or perhaps no longer quite human, and that distinction would prove fatal for the people who ended up in Bedlam. In the 14th century, Bedlam was tiny, a dozen patients at most. The records that survive give us only glimpses of who they were. A 1403 inventory lists 6 chains of iron, 6 locks, 4 pairs of manacles, and 2 stocks for the hands. This was the treatment equipment. Also listed 4 pairs of shackles and 2 other items called manacles. The Priory was clearly prepared for violence, for patients who needed to be restrained. The same inventory mentions that the hospital houses 6 men deprived of reason and others. 6 confirmed male patients, plus an unspecified number of others who might include women or might include patients whose madness was considered less severe. We don't know their names. We don't know what form their madness took. We know only that they were there, chained in cells, receiving whatever treatment the monks thought appropriate. The treatment would have been prayer, primarily, perhaps exorcism for those believed to be possessed, bleeding and purging according to humoral theory. And beyond that, confinement, simply keeping them from wandering the streets, from harming themselves or others, from embarrassing the families who'd placed them here, because that was often what it came down to. The mad were shameful. A lunatic in the family was a mark against everyone, a sign of divine disfavor or hereditary weakness. Better to put them somewhere out of sight, somewhere they could be forgotten. Bedlam was that somewhere. But not everyone stayed in Bedlam forever. Some patients recovered, or at least became calm enough to be released. And when they were released, they were given something remarkable, a license to beg. These Bedlam beggars became a fixture of medieval and early modern England. They wore distinctive badges or caps, identifying them as former inmates of Bethlem Hospital. This gave them legal permission to ask for charity, a valuable right in an era when unauthorized begging could land you in the stocks, or worse. The badge was both protection and stigma. It said, "I was mad. I have been released. I am harmless now, but I am not quite normal." have pity on me. Some of these beggars became famous characters. Tom o' Bedlam became a stock figure in English literature. The wandering madman, half pitied and half feared, singing strange songs and prophesying doom. Shakespeare put one in King Lear, when Edgar disguises himself as Poor Tom to escape his persecutors. Poor Tom, that eats the swimming frog, the toad, the tadpole, the wall newt, and the water, that in the fury of his heart, when the foul fiend rages, eats cow dung for sallets, swallows the old rat and the ditch dog, drinks the green mantle of the standing pool. It's deliberately disgusting, designed to evoke both horror and pity, and it reflects how the Bedlam beggar was viewed, as something not quite human, caught between the civilized world and something darker. Of course, the system was easily exploited. Healthy beggars would fake symptoms of madness to obtain a Bedlam license, which guaranteed them charity that ordinary beggars couldn't claim. Abraham men, they were called, after the biblical Abraham, or possibly after an Abraham ward in the hospital itself. The word became slang for faker, someone pretending to be mad for profit. Even then, madness was performance. Even then, the line between genuine illness and calculated act was blurry. And even then, people were profiting from the spectacle of lunacy. It would only get worse. It would only get. Somewhere in these early centuries, the name changed. Bethlehem became Bethlem in official documents, a standard contraction. But in common speech, Londoners slurred it further. Bethlem became Bedlam. The hospital itself, the building, the institution, all became simply Bedlam, and then the word escaped the building entirely. By the 15th century, Bedlam was being used as a general term for chaos, uproar, confusion. A crowded marketplace was Bedlam. A noisy household was Bedlam. Any situation of disorder and pandemonium was Bedlam. The transformation tells us something important. The hospital had become so synonymous with noise, with confusion, with the breakdown of order, that its name became the word for those things. The suffering inside its walls was so notorious that it redefined the English language, and it was about to get much, much worse. Because in 1676, Bedlam would move to a new building, a building designed to look like a palace, a building with gates that would open to the public for a penny admission, a building where the mad would become a show. The year is 1676. The Great Fire of London, which destroyed most of the medieval city 10 years earlier, is still fresh in memory. The old Bedlam, a cramped, decrepit collection of buildings that had grown haphazardly over 4 centuries, was spared by the fire, but condemned by common sense. It was falling apart, unsanitary even by 17th century standards, barely functional. The governors of Bethlem Hospital decided to build something new, something grand, something that would reflect the importance of their institution and the enlightened charity of their age. What they built was, by contemporary accounts, magnificent. The new Bedlam at Moorfields was designed by Robert Hooke, one of England's foremost scientists and architects. It was 540 feet long, one of the largest buildings in London. Its facade was modelled on the Tuileries Palace in Paris, with classical columns, ornate stonework, and an imposing central entrance. From the outside, it looked like a palace, a residence for royalty, a monument to civilization's highest aspirations. But look closer. Above the main gates, two massive stone sculptures by the artist Caius Gabriel Cibber. They're still famous today. You can see them at the Victoria and Albert Museum. They represent the two forms of madness as the 17th century understood them. On one side, raving madness. A muscular man in chains, his face contorted with fury, his body twisted as he strains against his bonds. He's wild, dangerous, the lunatic who must be restrained for everyone's safety. On the other, melancholy madness. A thin, dejected figure, slumped in despair, staring vacantly at nothing. The other face of madness, not violent but withdrawn, lost in some inner darkness that no light can reach. These were the guardians of Bedlam's gates, the promise of what waited inside, a declaration that the building might look like a palace, but it was a palace of pain. The irony was intentional. The governors knew exactly what message they were sending. Civilization on the outside, chaos within, order and madness, separated by nothing but a wall and a penny admission fee. And that admission fee is where the real horror begins. Public visiting at Bedlam wasn't new. The old building had allowed visitors too, but the new building was designed for visitors. The long galleries, the wide corridors, the cells arranged on either side like exhibits in a museum, all of it was built with spectators in mind. For 1 penny, later raised to 2 pence, anyone could enter. And they did, in astonishing numbers. At its peak in the early 18th century, Bedlam received an estimated 96,000 visitors per year. That's over 260 people per day, every day, paying to walk the galleries and gawk at the inmates. Holidays were especially popular. Easter Monday, the days between Christmas and New Year. Bank holidays when workers had time off and wanted entertainment. The crowds on these days were so large that the hospital had to hire extra staff just to manage them. Who came? Everyone. Aristocrats looking for novel amusement. Merchants and their wives on day trips. Foreigners visiting London who'd heard about this famous attraction. Young men on the town, often drunk, looking for laughs. Families with children, treating it as an educational outing. What did they do? They walked the galleries, peering into cells. They pointed and laughed at particularly entertaining inmates. They threw food, coins, or insults to provoke reactions. They poked at patients with sticks, which, as I mentioned, were sold at the entrance for this purpose. And they watched. The watching was the point. To see madness, to witness the breakdown of human reason, to feel the frisson of encountering something alien and terrifying, but safely behind bars, to look at these broken people and feel, by comparison, sane, normal, blessed. It was a human zoo, and the humans inside were the exhibits. Some patients became celebrities. Oliver Cromwell, who had briefly ruled England as Lord Protector, had a grandson who ended up in Bedlam. Visitors came specifically to see the great-grandson of the great usurper, to marvel at how the mighty had fallen. There was a former sea captain who believed he was still commanding a ship. He would issue orders to imaginary crew members, navigate imaginary storms, curse imaginary pirates. Visitors would play along, shouting, "Land ho!" and watching him react. There was a woman who claimed to be the Queen of Sheba. She held court in her cell, bestowing imaginary titles and demanding tribute from visitors who knelt before her ironically. There was a man who had been a respected scholar before his breakdown. He would quote Latin and Greek at visitors, mixing genuine erudition with complete nonsense. unable to distinguish between real memories and delusions. These star attractions learned to perform, to give the audience what it wanted. Coins thrown into their cells meant better food, small comforts, a moment of human contact, however degrading. The alternative was being ignored entirely. So they danced, they prophesied, they raved on command. They became the actors in their own tragedy, playing the part of lunatic for an audience that paid to be entertained by their suffering. The keepers encouraged this. A lively, entertaining inmate attracted more visitors, which meant more revenue. A boring inmate, one who simply sat quietly in their cell, was a wasted opportunity. Sometimes keepers would provoke patients deliberately before visiting hours, getting them agitated so they'd be more interesting to watch. It was a business. The patients were the product, and business was good. August 2nd, 1786. King George III is arriving at St. James's Palace when a woman approaches him, apparently to present a petition. Her name is Margaret Nicholson. She's a domestic servant in her 40s, neatly dressed, nothing remarkable about her appearance. The king reaches out to take her paper. That's when she pulls out the knife. It's a dessert knife, actually, old, worn, barely sharp enough to cut butter, but the intent is clear. Margaret Nicholson lunges at the king, trying to stab him. She fails. The blade barely nicks his waistcoat before guards tackle her. The king, displaying remarkable calm, actually prevents the guards from beating her too severely. "The poor creature is mad," George says. "Do not hurt her. She has not hurt me." With those words, George III probably saved Margaret Nicholson's life. Attempting to kill the king was high treason, punishable by hanging, drawing, and quartering. But if she was mad, if she literally didn't know what she was doing, then she couldn't be held criminally responsible. She was examined by doctors. They declared her insane. She was committed to Bedlam, and she became, instantly, the hospital's most famous attraction, the woman who tried to kill the king. Visitors flocked to see her. They paid extra for the privilege of being led to her cell. They stared at her, trying to understand what kind of lunatic would attempt regicide with a dessert knife. Margaret herself seems to have believed she was the rightful heir to the throne, that George was a usurper, that she was simply reclaiming what was hers. This delusion had apparently developed gradually over years. She'd written letters to the royal family before, trying to assert her claim. She never recovered. She never accepted that her beliefs were delusions. She lived in Bedlam for the next 42 years, until her death in 1828, still believing she was the true Queen of England. For 4 decades, visitors came to gawk at her. 4 decades of being an exhibit. 4 decades of strangers peering into her cell, laughing at the mad woman who thought she was a queen. George III himself would later descend into madness. Probably porphyria, though some historians argue it was bipolar disorder. He spent his final years confined to Windsor Castle, raving, blind, unable to recognize his own family. But at least he wasn't in Bedlam. At least he wasn't on display. And then there's James Tilly Matthews, perhaps the most fascinating patient Bedlam ever held, and perhaps the most tragic. Matthews was a tea broker, a respectable middle-class Londoner with business connections across Europe. In the early 1790s, during the French Revolution, he traveled to Paris as an informal diplomat, trying to negotiate peace between England and France. He failed, but something happened to him in France. Exactly what, we don't know. When he returned to England in 1796, he was different. He believed he was being persecuted. Specifically, he believed that a gang of French spies was operating a machine from a basement near London Wall. The machine was called the Heirloom, and it could control minds. It worked by weaving magnetic fluids into people's brains, forcing them to think and act according to the gang's wishes. Matthews believed the Heirloom gang was using this machine to manipulate British politicians, to sabotage the war effort, to control the government itself. And he believed they were targeting him personally, tormenting him with brain sayings, thoughts inserted into his head, sudden death-making, assassination attempts through magnetic waves, and lengthening the brain. A torture that caused his thoughts to stretch out endlessly. In 1797, he interrupted a session of Parliament by shouting "treason" from the public gallery, accusing the government of being controlled by French agents. He was arrested, examined, and committed to Bedlam. But here's the thing about James Tilley Matthews. He was not a raving lunatic. He was articulate, intelligent, and within his delusion, completely logical. He could explain the Heirloom in extraordinary detail, how it worked, who operated it, what its capabilities were. He drew technical diagrams of the machine that are still studied today, intricate illustrations showing pneumatic tubes, magnetic wheels, and other components. His descriptions of the Heirloom operators read like characters from a spy novel. Bill the King, the gang's leader, Jack the schoolmaster who manipulated politicians, Sir Archie, a woman who specialized in lobster cracking, crushing the victim's chest with magnetic force. Matthews knew their names, their habits, their schedules. Modern psychiatrists consider Matthews' case one of the first detailed documentations of paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions were elaborate, internally consistent, and resistant to any evidence that contradicted them. He couldn't be reasoned out of his beliefs, because within his mental framework, everything made perfect sense. He spent years in Bedlam insisting on his sanity. He wrote letters to politicians, to newspapers, to anyone who would listen. He claimed he was being wrongfully imprisoned, that he was perfectly rational, that the real madness was refusing to believe in the Heirloom conspiracy. 2 doctors actually examined him and concluded he was sane. The Bedlam authorities disagreed. He stayed. Eventually, Matthews was transferred to a private asylum where he spent his final years relatively peacefully, working as a gardener and helping with the institution's administration. He died in 1815, still believing in the Heirloom, still certain that magnetic forces were controlling the world. His case raises uncomfortable questions. How do you distinguish between a man with an elaborate delusion and a man who's simply wrong? Matthews was coherent, functional, even useful. He wasn't violent or disruptive. His only problem was that he believed something that couldn't be true. But who decides what's true? Who has the authority to declare that someone's beliefs are delusional rather than merely unconventional? In the 18th century, that authority belonged to the doctors and governors of Bedlam, and they didn't always use it wisely. Not everyone in Bedlam was genuinely mad. This is one of the darker aspects of the institution's history, and one that's often overlooked in accounts that focus on the treatment of the truly mentally ill. Bedlam was not just a hospital. It was also a dumping ground, a place where families could dispose of members who had become inconvenient, wives especially. In 18th century England, a married woman, had almost no legal existence separate from her husband. Her property became his upon marriage. She couldn't sue or be sued in her own name. She couldn't sign contracts. She had no right to divorce, even if her husband beat her, abandoned her, or spent every penny they had. But a husband could get rid of his wife, not through divorce. That required an act of parliament and was ruinously expensive, but through commitment. If a doctor declared a woman mad or nervous or suffering from hysteria, her husband could have her locked up. No court hearing required, no opportunity for the woman to defend herself. Just a doctor's signature, a payment to the institution, and she disappeared. What counted as madness in a woman? Disagreeing with her husband, refusing sex, spending money without permission, having opinions that contradicted his, showing excessive emotion, crying too much, or laughing too much, or being angry, showing too little emotion, being cold or unnatural. Essentially, any behavior a husband found inconvenient could be pathologized. Hysteria was the catch-all diagnosis. It came from the Greek word for uterus, because ancient doctors believed the womb could wander through a woman's body, causing madness when it lodged in the wrong place. By the 18th century, the anatomical theory was discredited, but the diagnosis remained. Any emotional disturbance in a woman could be labeled hysteria. Once committed, getting out was nearly impossible. A husband had to petition for release, and why would he? The woman's protests that she was sane were dismissed as further evidence of her madness. What lunatic admits they're lunatic? We don't know how many women in Bedlam were genuine psychiatric patients and how many were simply wives who had become inconvenient. The records don't distinguish. But the pattern was common enough to become a cultural trope. The mad woman in the attic, the wife locked away while her husband lived freely. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre features exactly this. Bertha Mason, Rochester's first wife, imprisoned in the attic of his home because she's mad. The novel was published in 1847, but the practice it depicted was centuries old. And it wasn't just wives, daughters who refused to marry the man their fathers chose, sisters who stood to inherit property that brothers wanted. Any woman who was troublesome or wealthy or inconvenient could find herself in Bedlam. The hospital was complicit. Money changed hands. Questions weren't asked. Another patient was admitted, and whatever she said about her sanity was ignored. She was in Bedlam, therefore she was mad. It was circular logic, and it trapped countless women in hell. It wasn't only women who could be inconveniently sane. Throughout its history, Bedlam occasionally received patients whose madness seemed remarkably political. Dissidents, troublemakers, people who embarrassed the powerful. The line between genuine mental illness and political inconvenience was often blurry. Someone who stood in public and denounced the king as a tyrant, was that free speech? Or was it evidence of derangement? Someone who claimed to have visions from God, instructing them to reform society, prophet or psychotic? The authorities got to decide, and they didn't always decide fairly. Alexander Cruden is one example. He was a Scottish bookseller, famous for creating a concordance of the Bible that's still used today. He was also, by most accounts, genuinely mentally unstable, prone to obsessive behavior, grandiose beliefs, and public outbursts. But his first commitment to an asylum came after he pursued a woman who rejected him, making a public nuisance of himself. Was that madness or just badly handled romantic rejection? His second commitment came after he criticized a political patron. His third came after he launched a campaign to reform public morals. Each time, he was declared mad. Each time, he protested that he was being imprisoned for his opinions, not his mental state. Each time, he was ignored. Cruden eventually wrote a book about his experiences called The London Citizen Exceedingly Injured, detailing the horrors of the private asylum where he was held, not Bedlam, but similar. He described being chained to a bed for weeks, being beaten by keepers, being denied food and water as punishment for asserting his sanity. He was probably somewhat mad, but he was also right that madness could be weaponized, that commitment could be used to silence critics and dispose of enemies. The power to declare someone insane is, ultimately, the power to make them disappear. In a society without strong legal protections for the accused mad person, that power could be terribly abused. But let's not pretend that most of Bedlam's patients were wrongfully imprisoned. Most of them were genuinely mentally ill, suffering from conditions we would now recognize as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, dementia, or psychosis caused by physical diseases like syphilis. These people needed help, needed treatment, needed, at minimum, compassionate care. What they got was Bedlam, and to understand what that meant, we need to talk about the treatments. 18th century medicine operated on principles that seem alien today. The body was understood as a system of fluids and forces that needed to be kept in balance. Disease, including mental disease, resulted from imbalance. Treatment meant restoring equilibrium. For madness specifically, the theory held that the brain had become overstimulated or understimulated, or filled with bad blood, or deprived of good blood. The mad person's nervous system was out of alignment. Their animal spirits, a kind of life force thought to flow through the nerves, had become disordered. The treatments that followed from this theory were logical given the premises. They were also horrifying. If madness came from an excess of blood, or from blood that had become corrupted, the obvious solution was to drain it out. Bleeding, also called bloodletting or phlebotomy, was standard medical practice for almost everything in this era. Fever? Bleed the patient. Infection? Bleed them. Headache? Bleed them. Madness? Bleed them repeatedly. The procedure was simple. A vein would be opened, usually in the arm, but sometimes in the forehead or neck for mental patients. Blood would be allowed to flow into a basin until the doctor judged enough had been removed, often a pint or more. The patient would typically feel faint, weak, dizzy. This was considered evidence that the treatment was working. The excitement of their madness was being reduced. Their animal spirits were calming down. In reality, they were experiencing blood loss. Their bodies were struggling to cope with sudden hypovolemia. The calming effect was simply the body shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core survival. Patients were bled again and again, weekly, sometimes daily during acute episodes. The cumulative effect was devastating. Chronic anemia, weakness, increased susceptibility to infection, and sometimes death from blood loss itself. If bad fluids caused madness, they could be expelled through other routes too. Purging meant inducing violent vomiting or diarrhea to flush toxins from the system. Emetics, drugs that cause vomiting, were administered regularly. Antimony compounds were common, as was ipecac. The patient would vomit repeatedly, often for hours, until nothing remained in their stomach but bile. Purgatives worked the other end. Strong laxatives would be given: castor oil, calomel, mercury chloride, various plant-based compounds, until the patient had explosive diarrhea that left them dehydrated and exhausted. The combination of repeated bleeding and purging left patients in states of extreme physical weakness. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't resist. They were too depleted to do anything but lie in their cells and wait for the next treatment. This was considered therapeutic progress. Blistering was based on the theory of counter-irritation. If the brain was inflamed or overstimulated, you could draw that inflammation away from the head by creating irritation elsewhere on the body. In practice, this meant applying caustic substances to the patient's skin, typically on the head, neck, or back, until large, painful blisters formed. Cantharides, Spanish fly, was commonly used, as were various acids and plant irritants. The blisters would be kept open, sometimes for weeks, weeping fluid that was believed to be drawing the disease out of the body. The pain was constant. The risk of infection was high, but the theory held that as long as the blisters were draining, the madness was flowing out with them. Some patients were blistered repeatedly over years, their bodies covered in scars from wounds that were never allowed to fully heal. Water treatment took many forms, but the most notorious was the cold bath. The theory: sudden immersion in cold water would shock the nervous system, jolting the brain out of its disordered state. The cold would constrict blood vessels, reduce inflammation, and reset the patient's mental processes. The practice: patients would be seized without warning, stripped, and plunged into tubs of ice-cold water. Sometimes they were held under until they nearly drowned. Sometimes they were dumped repeatedly in and out of the water until they were too exhausted to scream. Variations included the surprise bath, where water was dumped on patients from buckets overhead, and the continuous bath, where patients were kept immersed in water for hours or even days, their heads barely above the surface. The shock of cold water does have physiological effects. It triggers the dive reflex, slowing heartbeat and redirecting blood flow. But these effects have nothing to do with curing mental illness. What the cold bath actually achieved was terror. Patients became afraid of provoking the treatment. They learned to hide their symptoms, to appear calm, to say whatever their keepers wanted to hear. That looked like improvement. It was actually submission. And then there was the rotational chair. Invented by Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, and refined by various physicians over the decades, the rotational chair was exactly what it sounds like: a chair suspended from a frame that could be spun at high speed. The patient would be strapped in, sometimes with their head immobilized, sometimes free to flop around as momentum allowed. Then the chair would be rotated, faster and faster, for minutes at a time. The effects were immediate and violent: nausea, vomiting, disorientation. Patients would lose control of their bladders and bowels. Their eyes would roll back. Some had seizures. Some lost consciousness. The theory was that rotation would redistribute blood flow in the brain, breaking up whatever blockages or imbalances were causing the madness. In practice, it was torture. One physician reported that a patient spun at 100 rotations per minute showed beneficial effects. What those effects were, he didn't specify. Probably unconsciousness and terror. The rotational chair remained in use well into the 19th century. It was eventually abandoned, not because it was cruel. Cruelty wasn't yet a disqualifying factor in psychiatric treatment, but because it demonstrably didn't work. Patients who were spun repeatedly showed no improvement. They just became more afraid. American physician Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the father of American psychiatry, invented what he called the tranquilizing chair. It was the opposite of the rotational chair. Instead of movement, it imposed absolute stillness. The patient would be strapped into a chair with their arms, legs, and torso completely immobilized. A wooden box would be placed over their head, blocking all light and most sound. They would be left in this position for hours. Sometimes bleeding would be performed simultaneously, blood draining from the patient's arm while they sat in sensory-deprived darkness. Sometimes a bucket of cold water would be positioned above the box, dripping onto the patient's head. Rush believed this combination would reduce the pulse and calm overexcited nerves. He reported good results. His patients stopped screaming, stopped fighting, stopped showing signs of madness. They also stopped moving, stopped responding, stopped doing much of anything. Whether this represented cure or just broken surrender, Rush never asked. And underlying all of this, restraint. Bedlam's patients were routinely chained. Iron manacles around wrists and ankles, chains that ran from the manacles to rings set into the walls or floors. Patients who were considered dangerous or just difficult might be chained so tightly they couldn't stand, couldn't lie down, couldn't do anything but crouch in whatever position the chains allowed. The chains were heavy. They wore through skin, creating wounds that never healed. The metal grew cold in winter, adding frostbite to the patient's suffering. In summer, the same metal grew hot enough to burn. Some patients were chained continuously for years. They developed deformities, muscles atrophied from disuse, joints frozen in place, spines curved from being forced into unnatural positions. The straitjacket was developed in the late 18th century as a supposedly more humane alternative to chains. It immobilized the arms against the torso, preventing the patient from using their hands, but allowing them to walk. Whether this was actually more humane is debatable. Straitjackets could be just as constricting as chains, and the struggle against them could cause severe muscular strain and exhaustion. But chains remained common throughout the 18th century and into the 19th. They were cheap, they were effective, and they required minimal supervision. A chained patient couldn't escape, couldn't attack their keeper, couldn't do anything that required human attention. They could only wait, in pain, in filth, surrounded by others waiting in the same darkness. This was treatment. This was medicine. This was what passed for help in the house of madness. Let's walk through the building. Let's see what the patients actually experienced. You enter through the grand facade, passing beneath the sculptures of raving and melancholy. Madness. The entrance hall is impressive, designed to impress visitors, to demonstrate the institution's respectability. Then you move into the galleries. The main corridor runs the length of the building, over 500 feet. On either side, cells, small rooms, perhaps 6 feet by 6 feet. Iron bars on the front, so visitors can see in. Stone walls on the other 3 sides. There's a straw pallet on the floor, bedding, such as it is. A bucket in the corner for waste, emptied once a day if the patient is lucky, less often if they're not. A small window high in the wall, barred, admitting a little light but no view. no heating. In winter, the temperature inside the cells drops to near freezing. The straw offers minimal insulation. Patients who can afford it are given blankets. Those who can't simply endure. Some freeze to death. No ventilation beyond the barred window. The smell is overwhelming. Human waste, rotting straw, unwashed bodies. Visitors in the 18th century describe bringing perfumed handkerchiefs to hold over their noses. Some walk through quickly, unable to bear the stench. The sound is constant. Screaming, weeping, moaning, ranting, the clanking of chains, the raving of patients who haven't slept in days. The galleries echo, amplifying every noise, creating a cacophony that never truly stops. This is Bedlam. This is where the word comes from. The main galleries held patients considered potentially curable, those whose madness might eventually respond to treatment, who might someday be released. But there was another section, the incurable ward. Patients who showed no improvement after a certain period, typically a year, were transferred to the incurable ward. This wasn't a treatment facility, it was storage, warehousing human beings until they died. The incurable ward was even more neglected than the main galleries. Less staff, less supervision, less of everything. Patients were fed, kept alive, and otherwise ignored. Some spent decades there, growing older in darkness, forgotten by families who had stopped visiting years ago, waiting for death, which often came slowly. The incurable ward was where hope went to die, where patients who might have recovered with different treatment instead deteriorated, where the institution's failure became permanent. Who worked in this place? Who chose to spend their days in the house of madness? The keepers, the attendants who actually managed the patients day to day, were drawn from the lower classes, poorly paid, often illiterate, given absolute authority over their charges with minimal oversight. Some were genuinely compassionate, doing their best in impossible circumstances, but many were not. Corruption was endemic. Keepers would accept bribes from families to give patients better treatment, more food, cleaner bedding, fewer beatings. Patients whose families couldn't pay or wouldn't pay got the worst of everything. Theft was common. Whatever property patients brought with them, clothing, jewelry, money, often disappeared within days, taken by keepers who knew their victims couldn't effectively complain. Violence was routine. Keepers beat patients for any infraction, for being noisy, for being dirty, for being difficult to manage. The beatings were justified as discipline or treatment, but they were often simply expressions of frustration and cruelty. Sexual abuse occurred. Female patients were particularly vulnerable. Keepers had access to helpless women whose complaints would be dismissed as delusion. How many rapes went unreported, uninvestigated, unpunished? We'll never know. The physicians who officially ran the hospital were largely absent. They might visit once a week, briefly inspect the galleries, prescribe treatments, and leave. The actual work of caring for patients, or failing to care for them, fell to keepers who had no training, no supervision, and no accountability. Patients were fed twice a day. The food was minimal: bread, gruel, occasionally meat or vegetables. The quality was poor. What provisions the hospital purchased were often sold by keepers before reaching patients. Patients who couldn't feed themselves, those too confused, too restrained, or too broken to bring food to their mouths, sometimes simply weren't fed. They starved slowly, surrounded by people who had no obligation to help them. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Dehydration was common, especially among patients undergoing purging treatments that drained fluid from their bodies faster than it could be replaced. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Patients died of diseases they might have survived if they'd been properly nourished. Tuberculosis swept through the galleries regularly, finding easy victims among the weakened population. How many people died in Bedlam? The records are incomplete, but what survives suggests mortality rates that would be scandalous in any modern institution. In some years, a quarter of the patient population died. In others, more. Causes of death were rarely recorded accurately. Madness itself was often listed as the cause, as if insanity were a terminal disease rather than a condition that required treatment. Decay was another common entry. Exhaustion. Fever. What these euphemisms concealed: starvation, exposure, infection, suicide, violence from keepers or other patients. The cumulative effects of bleeding, purging, and other treatments. Bodies were buried in the hospital grounds in unmarked graves. There was no ceremony, often no notification to families. Patients simply disappeared from the records, from memory, from existence. The house of madness was also a house of death. And for over a century, almost no one cared. Change, when it came slowly, but it came. The 19th century brought new ideas about madness. The belief that the insane were beyond help, that they couldn't feel pain or cold or degradation the way normal people did, began to crack. Reformers started asking uncomfortable questions. If these treatments work, why don't patients get better? If the mad are insensible, why do they scream when beaten? The Quakers were among the first to offer an alternative. In 1796, a Quaker merchant named William Tuke founded the York Retreat, an asylum based on radically different principles. No chains, no beatings, no bleeding or purging. Instead, kindness, respect, occupational therapy. The belief that the mad were still human beings, capable of recovery if treated humanely. The York Retreat kept meticulous records. It could demonstrate that its patients recovered at higher rates than those in traditional asylums. That kind treatment actually worked better than brutality. This was revolutionary, not because the idea of kindness was new, but because someone had actually tested it, had proven empirically that the old methods weren't just cruel, they were counterproductive. The success of the York Retreat inspired reformers across England. People began to ask, if the Quakers can do it, why can't we? What's really happening in places like Bedlam? In 1814, a parliamentary committee was formed to investigate conditions in English asylums. What they found at Bedlam shocked even a society accustomed to public executions and child labor. The most notorious discovery was a patient named William Norris. Norris had been admitted to Bedlam in 1800 after attempting to kill an attendant at another institution. He was considered extremely dangerous, and so Bedlam staff had devised a special restraint system for him. Here's what the committee found 14 years later. Norris was encased in an iron harness. A rigid collar around his neck was attached to a vertical pole behind him. His arms were pinned to his sides by an iron frame that circled his chest. A chain ran from the harness to a ring in the wall, limiting his movement to a space of about 12 inches. He could not lie down. He could not sit comfortably. He could barely move at all. He had been in this position for over 9 years. When the committee asked Norris about his treatment, he answered lucidly and coherently. He was, by all appearances, no longer dangerously mad, if he ever had been. But no one had thought to check. No one had thought to ask whether the man in the iron harness still needed to be there. An artist accompanying the committee sketched Norris in his restraints. The image was published in newspapers and pamphlets. It became a symbol of everything wrong with Bedlam, everything wrong with how England treated its mentally ill. Norris died just a few months after the committee's visit, probably from tuberculosis exacerbated by years of immobility and malnutrition. He never knew he'd become famous. He never knew that his suffering would finally force change. The committee heard testimony from patients, from families, from doctors who had worked at Bedlam and could no longer stay silent. They heard about routine beatings, about patients left naked in freezing cells, about chains worn so long they had cut into flesh and become embedded, about women raped by keepers, about children as young as 8 locked in the adult wards. They heard about patients who arrived with treatable conditions and died within months, about families who paid for care their relatives never received, about corruption so pervasive that honesty was the exception rather than the rule. The physicians who ran Bedlam defended themselves. The mad don't feel pain the way we do, they argued. Restraint is necessary for everyone's safety. The treatments are standard medical practice, but the evidence was overwhelming. The defenses sounded hollow even to sympathetic ears. Something had to change. The 1815 parliamentary report led to immediate reforms. Public visiting was officially banned. No more penny admission, no more tourists gawking at inmates. The human zoo was closed. New regulations limited the use of chains and other restraints. Physicians were required to justify each restraint in writing and to review cases regularly. Inspections became mandatory. Outside officials would visit Asylum regularly, interview patients, check conditions. The absolute authority of the institution was broken. The building itself was condemned. In 1815, Bedlam moved to a new location in Southwark, still an institution for the mentally ill, but supposedly designed with more humane principles in mind. Did the reforms work? Partially. Conditions improved. The worst abuses were curtailed. Patients were no longer quite so helpless against institutional cruelty, but the fundamental problem remained. Society still didn't know what to do with the mentally ill. The reforms changed how patients were confined, but they didn't challenge the necessity of confinement itself. Bedlam remained an asylum, a place apart, a system for removing troublesome people from society. And the Victorian era would bring a new form of horror: the massive county asylums designed to hold thousands of patients, built across England in the decades following the Bedlam reforms. The cruelty became more diffuse, more bureaucratic, but it didn't disappear. The shadow of Bedlam stretched long into the future. What happened to the building? The Palace of Madness at Moorfields, the one with the grand facade and the chained figures above the gates. It was demolished in 1815 when the hospital moved. The site became a park, Finsbury Circus, where Londoners walk their dogs and eat lunch on benches, probably unaware they're standing where people were once chained and tortured. The second Bedlam in Southwark survived longer. When the hospital moved again in 1930, the building was converted to other uses. During World War II, it housed the Imperial War Museum. The War Museum is still there today. If you visit London, you can walk through the galleries where patients once screamed in their cells. You can stand in rooms where women were chained for the crime of disagreeing with their husbands. You can look at exhibits about the machinery of war, standing on ground, soaked in a different kind of suffering. The building doesn't advertise its history. There's no plaque saying, Bedlam was here. We've preserved the architecture but erased the memory, turned a monument to one kind of human cruelty into a monument to another. Bethlem Royal Hospital still exists. It moved to Beckenham in Kent in 1930, where it operates today as a modern psychiatric facility. It's a far cry from the institution we've been discussing, regulated, professional, committed to patient welfare. But the word Bedlam survives. Every time we use it to describe chaos or confusion, we're invoking the ghosts of those galleries, the people who screamed there, the people who died there, and the questions Bedlam raised haven't been answered. Not really. What do we do with people whose minds work differently? The ones who see things that aren't there, or believe things that can't be true? The ones who frighten us because they remind us how fragile sanity really is. We've closed the old asylums, emptied them out in the name of community care and deinstitutionalization. But where did the patients go? Some went to group homes, to supportive housing, to families who could care for them. They're the success stories. Others ended up in prison. The largest mental health facilities in America today are jails: Cook County in Chicago, L.A. County, Rikers Island in New York. People who would have been in Bedlam 200 years ago are now in cells of a different kind. Still others ended up on the streets. The homeless encampments in every major city are full of people with untreated mental illness, people who fall through the cracks of a system that doesn't know what to do with them. We don't chain them anymore. We don't make them perform for paying visitors. We don't subject them to rotational chairs or cold baths. But we still don't know how to help them. We still look away when we pass them on the street. We still treat mental illness as something shameful, something to be hidden, something that happens to other people. Every era has its bedlams, places where the inconvenient are hidden, where suffering happens out of sight, where we put the people we don't want to think about, the tourists who paid their pennies to laugh at the mad. They weren't monsters. They were ordinary people, doing what their society told them was acceptable, enjoying entertainment that their culture endorsed, acting normally by the standards of their time. Which raises the uncomfortable question that every story like this must raise. What are we doing right now, convinced of our own moral righteousness, that future generations will view with the same horror we feel looking back at Bedlam? What are our chains? What are our cold baths? What are our penny gates? The ghost of Bedlam doesn't ask us to feel guilty about the past. We can't change what happened in those galleries. We can't unchain William Norris or free Margaret Nicholson or give James Tilly Matthews the treatment he deserved. But we can look clearly at our own time. We can ask who we're hiding, who we're ignoring, whose suffering we've decided doesn't count. That's what Bedlam teaches us. That's why this story matters. Not because the past was cruel, we knew that already, but because the past can show us who we might become and warn us about who we already are. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest institutions. If you found value in this deep dive into the shadows of the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. Your support allows us to continue illuminating the corners of history that others would prefer to forget. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? I'm always fascinated to know who's joining us in the darkness. This has been the story of Bedlam, the house of madness, the word we use for chaos without knowing why. Till next time, This has been the Midnight Archives.